All right, hi, my name is Shalini Mishra. I'll be filling in for Professor Stokols today. A little bit about myself. I am a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Planning, Policy and Design here at UCI. I got my PhD in Planning, Policy and Design, specializing in environmental psychology about 2 years ago. And since then, I've been working on a project about the science of team science, which you probably would have heard of in some of the initial lectures that Professor Stokols gave. My research interests lie in the area of virtual environments, and specifically how virtual environments and the internet and cell phones affect our social behavior and our physical health. But today, we will be talking about this broad area of interpreting the environment. So specifically, we'll be talking about environmental cognition. So you had this reading by Russell Schweickart about space age and the planetary awareness. So this is an astronaut who participated in the Apollo 9 mission in the late 1960s, I think 1969. And he had the opportunity to participate in a number of astronautical feats. And what this 10-day experience did for him was to change his perception of the Earth as a planet and his relationship to the living beings on the Earth. So he went around the Earth 151 times throughout those 10 days, every 1.5 hours. And what happened was that he began to see the Earth not as a big thing with all its details and all its borders and boundaries, but as a little thing in a vast universe of the space. So he began to objectify the Earth and see it without all its borders and boundaries. And I like this quote a lot from the reading. He says, when you go around the Earth in 1.5 hours, you begin to recognize that your identity is with that whole thing. That makes a change. You look down and you can't imagine how many borders and boundaries you cross, hundreds of people killing each other over some imaginary line that you are not even aware of. You wish you could take each by the hand and say, look at it from this perspective. Look at what is important. So he was able to see this Earth as a tiny little object which you could block out with your thumb. And he was an American, of course, and in the beginning, he started identifying with the city, the city that he was brought up in, Houston, that he worked. But as time went by, he began identifying with other cities and the whole country and then other countries. So environmental perception, this is where environmental cognition and environmental perception come in. The perspective with which you take to look at an object or an environment makes a big difference in guiding your thoughts, actions, and behavior regarding that environment. So this brings us to the differences between objects and environment. So objects require subjects, and in contrast, one cannot be a subject of an environment, only a participant. So what this first point is talking about is the relationship that people have with their environments. People or individuals and groups are participants in their environments rather than being subjects in their environments. What that means is that there is a dynamic relationship between people and environments. What you do affects the environment, and the environment in turn affects your physical health, your behavior, your emotions. And that is not true in case of subjects. Let's think of the example of looking at the Earth from hundreds and thousands of miles away. You are not a participant in that environment. The environment does not surround you, or the object doesn't surround you. Environments do surround the individual. Environments engage multiple sense modalities. You can kinesthetically move in your environment. You can sense it, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can smell it. You can't do all of those things with an object. Objects, by far, may engage only 1 or 2 sense modalities. Environments offer peripheral information. That means you can perceive things in your environment. You can see what's around you. Objects do not do that. Environment perception always involves action. So you have the potential to act, behave. Action means behavior. Once you perceive something in an environment and have the chance to process that information. Environments convey symbolic meanings and messages which objects may not. So for example, temples, churches, cities, and hometowns of people, they have special meanings. They hold special meanings for people, and objects might not. Environments have an ambience or an atmosphere. So think of your favorite coffee shop that you go to. It has a special atmosphere that you like being in, that you like working in. Objects do not have an ambience or an atmosphere. So this framework is one way of explaining the field of environmental psychology. All of the research areas in this discipline come under these forms and phases of transaction. You can think of, two forms of transaction and two phases of transaction in this 2x2 table. So you have the cognitive phase and the behavioral, or the cognitive form and the behavioral form, and the active phase and the reactive phase. So what does that really mean? Cognitive, anyone knows what cognition means? Exactly, involving thoughts and emotions. So cognition involves knowledge, act, and emotions. And behavioral involves actions. Phases of transaction, the active phase. Any ideas of what active could mean in this sense? Exactly, when you're actually the environment is guiding your behavior, and you bring thoughts and goals into that environment with the purpose of acting in that environment. And reactive, any ideas what reactive could mean? Exactly, passive responses to the environment, where you're not truly aware of what is happening, but you are reacting to the environment without your knowledge that the environment is having an influence on you. So this could be physical, emotional, behavioral, any different forms. So, and each of these dyads have different names: interpretive, operative, evaluative, and responsive. You're going to talk about all of these throughout the class, but we're going to focus on this first dyad, interpretive, this week, and specifically on the cognitive representation of the spatial environment. So, this brings us to an important concept in environmental cognition, and that is of a cognitive schema. What do you think a schema is, and why is it important? Yes, it's like a mental map, a conceptual framework that guides, how you evaluate and understand your environment. It's not very complicated. We have schemas of everything around our world, and we can't see a schema, you can't touch a schema. It's just a framework to understand mental processes. Just think of it as a word or as a construct that helps us understand these mental processes. So it's a mental representation of the world around us, and the world around us could be the spatial world, our social relationships, the combination of socio-physical relationships, cultural relationships, and a schema provides symbolic categories with which we can make predictions about the environment and evaluate alternative plans of action. And we'll talk about that a little more in the following slides. So what is a cognitive map? A cognitive map is a type of schema, but it specifically pertains to the spatial environment. And how are cognitive maps externalized? We can't see a cognitive map, but one way of externalizing cognitive maps that people have is by asking people to draw sketch maps of their particular environments. And can you tell me what you understood about cognitive maps from the Lynch reading? You had the Lynch chapters. What do you think a cognitive map is, and how is it different from other maps? Excellent explanation. So cognitive maps are not cartographical maps. Cognitive maps are different for every person. It's not an objective representation of the environment, but it's a subjective kind of representation of how we think of the environment. We bring our own values, our thoughts, our experiences, our past experiences in the way we understand our environments, our spatial environments, and that's what these cognitive maps could reflect. It's an indirect way of getting at our experiences and values and emotions and perhaps our past experiences as well. Let's talk about cognitive mapping, okay? So cognitive mapping simply is the process of acquiring information about the environment. It's pretty much simple. We're cognitive mapping. You can think of that when you enter a new environment, you're mapping the environment all the time without your knowledge about it. So we're engaging in this process of negotiating and understanding our environment and making schemas about our spatial world, and that's just a process of acquiring information about the spatial environment. So before we go into elements of cognitive map, I want to show you why are cognitive maps important.
Hello.
You have a collect call from.
Hey, buddy, don't say no! Except, down to Madeline's. I told her, you gotta move or it's over.
Well, what happened?
I think it's over. We had a big fight. She threw me out. I started walking, and now I'm lost downtown. I don't have anybody. I don't recognize anybody. I miss home. I don't even know how to get there.
What's around you?
I'm looking at Ray's Pizza. You know where that is?
Is it famous Ray's?
No, it's Original Ray's.
Famous original Ray's?
It's just original, Jerry.
Well, what street are you on?
Hey, I'm on First and First. How can the same street intersect with itself? It must be at the nexus of the universe.
Just wait there. I'll pick you up. And Kramer, stay alive. No matter what occurs, we'll find you.
All right, that was a little bit dramatic, but what's the point? Why are cognitive maps important? Why is it worth studying this in environmental cognition? How do you feel when you go into a new environment that you're not able to negotiate? Suppose when you're traveling, for example, without a map and you get lost, where you don't have a clear cognitive map of the environment. Yes, stressful, exactly. You need cognitive maps to organize your environment, to have some framework of the environment. So what do you think about, why cognitive maps are important? Excellent, excellent. To make decisions about the environment. How can we guide our behavior if we don't know anything about our environment, if we haven't organized it? Excellent point. Other examples? Yes. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, exactly. Unfamiliarity with an environment can lead to a lack of exploration, for example, of the environment. That's good. Good point. And personalities guide that behavior. Great. Other thoughts? Yes.
You can talk about how connected people feel to their environment. Because if they have a very detailed map, then they might be connected to more places. They might be interacting with their environment a little more thoroughly. But if they have kind of a vague or incomplete map, then maybe it says how committed they feel or how part of it they feel to their environment.
Wonderful, exactly. And you have a reading about this fact in the Milgram and Jodelet article about the psychological maps of Paris, which is exactly about these points. Excellent point. You're already an environmental psychologist. So this famous urban planner, Kevin Lynch, was very interested in cognitive maps. And he took this concept and tried to see how people experience their cities and how they interact with them with the aim of designing better environments, better cities. And what he found in his research of Boston, Los Angeles, New York, many different cities, is that invariably these cognitive maps of people have these 5 elements. So one of the elements are paths. Anyone can tell me what a path is in terms of Kevin Lynch's conceptual framework? Yes. Yes, exactly. It's a channel through which people and vehicles can move through, and it's a passageway, exactly what it means, in the English, as opposed to a lot of scientific concepts which, say something and mean something else. Path is exactly that. So what's an example of a path in UC Irvine? Yes. Yeah, Ring road, exactly. Yes. Was that your answer? Oh, I'm sorry. Any other examples of path? Back Bay, yes, excellent. So let's look at the definition of a path. A channel along which an observer moves, maybe streets, walkways, transit lines, canals, or railroads. All right, let's look at edges. So what's an edge, according to Kevin Lynch? It's not considered a path. You can't move along it, but it's kind of a separation element between 2 areas, is what you're trying to say. That's right. Any example of an edge within our community, Irvine or UCI? Look at it in terms of a larger scale environment. Yes. Yes, bridges could be a path. It could be an edge as well. It depends. Like the Watson Bridge separates University Center from the main campus, for example. Yes, that's a good example. Yes.
Mountains or deserts?
Yes, that's a very good example of or the shoreline that we have, the Pacific coast. That's an example of an edge, a thing that is not really used as a path, but that, physically separates this area, the city, from another element. Excellent. All right, let's look at the definition. It's a linear element, that's it. So it has to be a straight line or almost a straight line, not used or considered paths by observers. Shores, railroad cuts, edges of development, walls, etc. Everyone clear with the concept of edges? I find that usually students have. Yes?
When there's open space,
Mm-hmm.
it's really not used very much, like a block of private, like there was private land or government land or something that people don't really access.
Yeah, like a no man's land. Excellent. Yeah, that's excellent. That could be an edge. Because suppose, think of the borders between countries. You know, there's always a space between two countries which is not really considered anyone's space. That's kind of a transition space, and that could be considered an edge. If that border is not just an imaginary border on a map, but it's defined by some physical element, suppose it has a wall, or a group of hills, or a shoreline, or a railroad, then that border would be considered an edge. It's not an imaginary line or a border. Let's look at the other elements. Districts. The UCI campus is a district itself in terms of the Irvine city as a whole. Any examples of districts within the campus? The social sciences quad around here, maybe that's a district. Other examples, yes.
Like the different housing, like Mesa or Midland.
Good, yeah, that's a great example of a district. Yes. Yes, very good example of a district, exactly. Another example, there are lots of little districts. I think our campus is kind of organized that way. What's the definition of a district? You already said that. So it's a medium to large section of a city having a two-dimensional extent. So it's a plane, a two-dimensional extent, which the observer mentally enters inside of. It could be physically enters inside of as well. So that's an example of Central Park in New York City or Manhattan. These are examples of Times Square. That's an example of a district. Okay, next. Nodes. What are nodes and examples of nodes? Exactly. Lots of people, streets, intersect with each other. Excellent definition. What's an example of a node? Student center. Exactly. Student center. Great node. That's like our public square. Other examples. Aldrich Park could be a node. It's pretty big, but it's a place. It's circular, so that kind of makes it hard for it to be a node. But there are passageways in between, so you could, in a sense, consider it a node because it connects. The passageways connect to the social sciences to the biological sciences. So in a way you could, but it's more of a district, I would say, Aldrich Park. All right, examples of nodes in the city. Does Irvine have a node? Irvine is not a traditional city to think of for nodes, but maybe it could be. So nodes, it's a strategic point in a city which the observer can enter, primarily junctions, crossing of paths, a square, a street corner hangout. So for example, that's Times Square, that could be a node. Or the Grand Central Station in New York City, that's an example of a node. Just think of it as a place where many people meet, many paths cross, and it's an interaction point. So the flagpoles, for example, in UCI, that's an example, a good example of a node, because that's where, people come into the buses stop there, and that's an example of a node. Landmarks, examples of landmarks. Statue of Liberty, excellent example. So it's a memorable piece of architecture, could be a sculpture, could be a building that provokes, that makes the place imageable. So that's an example of a landmark. I think Irvine has a lack of landmarks. Yes?
I was going to say the airplane hangar.
Yes, that could be. Yeah, that's huge, and it could pass as a landmark because it's something visible and memorable. So landmarks is a type of point of reference. You have to think of it when you're thinking of examples. You think, is this a point of reference? But the observer does not enter within them. Maybe a building, a sign, or a store. All right. So one of the concepts that Kevin Lynch and Milgram and Jodelay studied was imageability, or the qualities of a physical object or environment that give it a high probability of evoking a strong image or memory in the observer. So for example, Paris. Paris is a very imageable city. London, a very imageable city. New York City, very imageable city. Any examples in your experience about imageable cities, small towns, or large-scale environments? What would you consider an imageable? Yes?
So weren't you living in the Great Park in Irvine?
Yes, could be. Although it's not really visible from everywhere, but it could be. Maybe that's a mark. Yes?
Does it also be man-made?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, in this context, I think Kevin Lynch thought of it as being something man-made, and especially in urban environments, because he was not thinking something like Mount Rushmore, for example. That's very imageable, but that's not an urban environment. So in the sense of an urban environment, I think it would have to be a man-made kind of structure. Yes. The what tower? Yes, that's a good example. Yes, others. Yeah, the Balboa and the Island Ferry. That could be an element that makes Irvine imageable. Yes. Yeah, the Grand Canyon, very image. It's not, although it's not an urban element. We're talking in terms of urban environments. So think of structures that, think of that. Is the Grand Canyon a point of reference? Not in the sense of an urban environment, for example. It's not within an urban environment. Yes, other questions or other examples. Landmarks need to be individual things or individual structures, but imageability considers a gamut of structures and elements. So different shapes of buildings and types of buildings, old structures, beautiful architecture, they all add to the imageability of the environment, of the urban environment. Other questions, examples, thoughts, anything? Yes. Yes, the DC Mall area, exactly. I'm going there, so yeah, that's right. That's a really great example of imageability and also landmarks. Yes, Staples Center. Sorry, not familiar. Mark, do you know anything about the Staples Center?
Something being imageable?
Yeah.
Depends if you're a Laker fan or not.
So legibility, another concept that Kevin Lynch came up with, was in terms of describing urban environments and the qualities of urban environments, was the ease with which the parts of an environment can be recognized or organized in a coherent pattern. So some cities are more legible, he found, than others. So for example, New York City, with its grid structure, was found to be more legible to people in their cognitive maps as compared to Irvine, for example, which is not organized in that kind of intuitive fashion. What do you think about that? Any examples of legible cities versus not very legible cities? Do you think it's easy to negotiate UCI as an environment, easy to structure it? Yes, it is actually, because it seems to me at least, and I'm not very good at negotiating environments, so it's organized around this Aldrich Park, and the planners and designers of UC Irvine very much used Kevin Lynch's concepts in designing UC Irvine in terms to make it, legible and coherent. Right. So cognitive maps are one way of understanding people's perceptions of their environments. There are other ways of doing this. So for example, how do you measure imageability in an environment? So these are two examples of high imageability versus low imageability environments. High imageability places have a lot of pedestrians, strong landmarks. So Times Square in New York City, for example, is a very imageable place compared to this nondescript kind of place, which could be anywhere, nothing unique, doesn't have any character, no pedestrians, few features, no outdoor dining, for example. And no landmarks, no interesting architectures. That's why it is low in imageability. Another example of measuring imageability is recording the shape of buildings. So for example, rectangular shapes, straight lines versus curved shapes, different sizes and dimensions of buildings, for example, aspect ratios from the car, how does it look from the car as opposed to walking across the streets. These are all aspects of measuring the imageability of an urban environment. So social imageability, this brings us to the concept of social imageability. And we've been talking about how cognitive maps are very individual and, each one has his own or her own, and they're guided by our own experiences and thoughts and values of the environment and also our social status. But Milgram and Jodelet, when they studied the psychological maps of Paris, actually found that, you could have unique cognitive maps, but what you find important and what is salient in your mind and what is highlighted within an environment by you is very much guided by what is important and highlighted by the community. So they found out that, cities or the perception of a city is a social fact. And as such, needs to be studied as a collective as well as an individual aspect. It is not only what exists, but what is highlighted by the community that acquires salience in the mind of the person. So how did they really figure this out? So we'll talk about some of their studies and experiments. So they They did out of a number of studies on the city of Paris and Parisian tourists and residents of different types, different socioeconomic status, different education levels, occupations. And one of their studies was this last walk technique. So they asked their sample to draw a map. They said, well, you are going to be exiled from Paris. And you have only one last chance to take a walk across the city. And they gave them an unmarked map of the city and asked them to trace a route that they would take to in their last walk. And that's why they called it the last walk technique. And what they found was that invariably there are 3,500 streets in Paris, and if cognitive maps were so idiosyncratic, we would see all of these different types of routes and places depending on people's thoughts and values. But what was found was that a large number of people highlighted this area, which is this dark highlighted area in the map, in their maps. The route around Champs-Élysées, the River Seine, the Ile de la Cité, these famous places in Paris which are very important to the community. So what they found out, and they concluded, was that our perceptions of our city are guided by what is socially, culturally, and historically important. And that's why a city is a social fact. And this is just another example of how they organize their data. So the places in people's map that were highlighted the most are in a larger font. So the River Seine, the Eiffel Tower, Étoile, Champs-Élysées, these were places that came out to be most prominent in the cognitive maps of Parisians. What do you think is the difference between, or the relationship between social imageability and imageability? Although the social imageability brings out physical elements in people's map, but it is guided by the social, cultural, historical values and experiences. Whereas imageability focuses more on the physical elements of a city. Excellent. But they're related to each other. Usually, imageable places are also very socially imageable. So there's another study, which you don't have as a reading, but I'll introduce it to you, by Orleans, in the early 70s. And he was very interested in the relationship between people's socioeconomic status and the cognitive maps that they drew. And this example is closer to home. So he did the study in Los Angeles, where he had a sample of 25 residents from different neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So he took an African-American community in Avalon, and he had a Spanish-speaking community in Boyle Heights, and then he had the Westwood community, which is predominantly Caucasian. And he asked them to draw these cognitive maps. And this is what he found. This is the Westwood area, which is upper middle class, and that's the Spanish-speaking area. That's an example of a map. And this is the city, Los Angeles City, as perceived by residents in Avalon. So what do you see up front in these maps and the differences between these categories of people? Why are these maps of people in the so-called lower socioeconomic status in the Avalon area and in the Boyle Heights area, why are they so diminished and restricted? Access to public transportation, the time and the leisure time to be able to explore one's environment. So especially in a city like Los Angeles, you can't get very far without a car. So the people of lower socioeconomic status, their lives might be restricted to their neighborhoods and their workplaces. And they just don't have access to these environments and the chance to explore it. So this is a provocative example of the effect of the socioeconomic status on people's cognitive maps. Okay, so we're back. We're almost at the end of the class. We'll do a class participation exercise. So I just wanted to bring you back to this conceptual framework. We'll be talking, I won't be, but Professor Stokos will talk about personality and the environment in the next class. That's another part of the active cognitive dyad of this conceptual framework. And we'll be talking about the Gosling article in which people's bedrooms and living spaces reflect their personalities, how physical environments reflect individuals' personalities. And as a segue into that topic, we'll do a class participation exercise about a different kind of environment, your oral environments and your music selections choices. So I want you all to take out a piece of paper, list your 5 all-time favorite songs. All right, now I want you to exchange your your paper, your 5 songs with the person sitting on your left. Be a psychologist, an environmental psychologist, and make an assessment of the personality of this person based on his or her song selection.